Yeah, I'm getting you to give a class for me today, Warren. Thank you. Bom dia a todos. Em primeiro lugar, gostaria de dar boas-vindas a todos os presentes, todos que estão nos acompanhando via YouTube. É uma grande satisfação realizar essa edição especial da CTIT Convida, que é um evento, uma série de eventos de webinars que proporcionam espaço para a gente discutir temas ligados à ciência, tecnologia e inovação, no contexto da universidade, também no contexto externo. E esse evento, em particular, a gente está fazendo junto com o Departamento de Ciência da Computação, o DCC, porque o tema que nós vamos abordar hoje se refere a jogos. No caso, em particular, a gente tem a presença do Warren Robinett, com quem eu trabalhei junto. A gente vou fazer uma apresentação sobre ele, mas alguns de vocês já devem ter visto até o nome dele em um dos filmes recentes que saíram do Spielberg, do Jogador 1. O Warren, ele é um designer de computação gráfica, interativa e outras formas de computação em hardware. Ele concebeu e implementou diversas soluções pioneiras na área de realidade virtual, de empresas na área de Educatech, que a gente chama aqui, né, e jogos de videogame. Além disso, trabalhou na fundação de startups, trabalhou na HP, com quem eu trabalhei junto, jogos de aventura, nanomanipuladores, enfim, ele foi conhecido, né, se tornou famoso, assim, vamos falar dessa forma, por incluir o Easter egg em um dos seus jogos, né, que é o Ready Player One. Então, gostaria, então, de agradecer Warren por estar participando e generosamente cedendo um pouco do seu tempo. E eu vou agora, se vocês me permitirem, conduzir o evento em inglês. Será colocado legenda automática aqui, então pode ser que ocorra alguns problemas. Então, now I'm going to switch to English. So it's a pleasure to have Warren Robinett coming over to our series of meetings. And I have the pleasure of working with Warren laboratories in California. So Warren has been doing all sorts of stuff, like working on a nano manipulator. It was a hardware that was put together so that one could touch nanostructures. That's not the topic of his talk today, but also working with neuromorphic hardware, the theme that we work together on at Hewlett-Packard. But today Warren is going to be talking a little bit about the adventure game, a game that actually I had the pleasure of playing when I was a kid. I was, I think, 12 years old. And I did play that game, never had the idea that I would end up working with Warren. So with further ado, I'll turn it over to Warren, and I would like to thank Warren for his generosity in sharing some of his time and spending this morning with us. So welcome, Warren.
Thank you, Gio. Here are the slides. You can see that, I hope. So my name is Warren Robinett. I'm going to tell you about a video game I designed in 1978-79 called Adventure, which was the first action-adventure game.
Warren, I don't think we can see it yet.
Oh.
The presentation slide.
Oh. All right, let's try again. Share screen. Maybe I chose the wrong one. Is that better?
There you go.
Okay, so my name is Warren Robinett, and I'm going to tell you about Adventure, a game I designed in the late 70s, which is considered to be the first action-adventure game, first of the genre. Now, let's advance slides, okay? So here's an outline of the talk. First, I'm going to give you some background on Atari and the Atari 2600 console, the hardware that was underneath the video game. And I'm going to focus on this talk on resource-limited programming because I understand that the audience is technical, at least a lot of you. And so it's a little bit of a dive into the problems I had as in terms of programming problems, what obstacles faced me and how I was able to overcome them in order to implement this game. And so in this focus on implementation, there are two reasons. The short answer, how did I do it, was good data structures and efficient coding. But the data structures are a little bit easier to describe in a short talk than getting into the details of how I made programs small. So it's mainly going to be the data structures. Now, the backstory here is I was 26 years old. I had been working for Atari about 6 months, and I was finishing up my first video game, which was called Slot Racers. And you see some images on the screen of this video game. It was a game in a maze, chasing each other and shooting missiles at one another, okay? And I needed an idea for my next video game, but first I'm gonna just show you a brief video of what Slot Racers was like, which will give you an idea of what kind of graphics resources I had to work with when I made Adventure. All right, so I'm going to switch to a video here. Now, hopefully you see this mostly blue image with a little green, light green thing and a light pink thing. Do we see that, Gio?
Perfect.
Okay, good. So the green thing and the red thing are supposed to be cars. The graphics resources available were not all that great. And this is an overhead view of two cars driving on in a maze. And in a second, they're going to be shooting missiles at one another. And they can start and stop, and they can also make turns, which they will do in a second. So you just saw one shoot a missile at the other one. Okay. So the green thing and the pink thing are sprites. And this system had a total of 5 sprites, and only 2 of them had actually any image to be shown. The 3 low resolution sprites were just a single rectangle, like the missiles that you're seeing. And then the other graphic resource was the background, called the play field, which is what makes the maze. So this is all you had as an Atari video game designer: a few sprites and 1 low resolution background. Okay. Now we're going to get out of that. Share screen. Let's get the right one. All right, now we're back in the slides, I hope. Oh, come on. I'm getting a message. Okay. So you see an image of the Atari 2600 console, the hardware that was beneath the video game software. And this was the Atari 2600, also called the Video Computer System, was very, very limited in terms of what hardware resources it had inside of it. Memory, 4K of memory. Memory was very expensive 40 years ago. And the amount of RAM memory that was available was even less, 128 bytes, which is 1/8 of a K. And also the processing power was not very strong either. It had a weak 8-bit processor. The clock rate was slow, 1.2 megahertz. You just saw the crude 2D graphics. How does this compare with, for example, a modern cell phone like an iPhone 13? An iPhone today actually has 1 million times as much memory as I had for the program for Adventure. 4K, if you multiply it by 1,000, you get 4 megabytes. And if you multiply it by another 1,000, you get 4 gigabytes. You guys writing software for cell phones have 1 million times as much memory as I had. And the clock speed only went up by a factor of 2,000, but it's still quite a lot. And nowadays you have GPU graphics in a cell phone, whereas you just saw the crude 2D graphics that we had to work with as Atari game designers. So what was game design like back in the late 70s at Atari? Well, it was different than it is now. It was not done by big teams then. In fact, each Atari 2600 game was produced by one person. You had the idea, you wrote the code, You created the graphics and the sound effects. You tested it on kids. You tracked down the bugs. You decided when it was ready to ship. So people sometimes ask me, where did I get the idea for making Adventure? And I have a very clear answer for that. While I was working on Slot Racers, my housemate took me over. So I lived close to Stanford University. I had a housemate named Julius Smith. And one day he took me over to the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab where he worked. And we played this game. Nowadays it's called Colossal Cave. It was the first text adventure game. It was created by Willie Crowther and Don Woods. It was 100% text. You typed in a text command and then it gave you back a text response. And then you typed another command and it gave you back another text description of where you were at and what you were carrying. Didn't use any graphics, pure text. And this game blew my mind. And I decided that I wanted to implement this concept for my next video game, because you could move around in this big game world. It had different rooms. It was set in a cave. There were magical objects you could pick up. And there were obstacles, a couple of monsters. So I'm going to give you a sample of it. The blue text is what I type. And then the black text is what the system responds back to me. So I would type, enter building. Then it would say, you're inside a building, a well house for a large spring. There's some keys on the ground here. There's a shiny brass lamp nearby. Then these were objects in the game, and you could pick them up. Take keys. Okay. Take lamp. Okay. And then you could start moving through the game world. Leave building. You're in front of building. Go south. You're in a valley in a forest beside a stream tumbling along a rocky bed. Go south. At your feet, all the water splashes into a 2-inch slit in the rock. Downstream, the stream bed is bare rock. So that gave you a little sample of what it was like to play a text adventure game. And I thought I could make a video game for the Atari 2600 containing rooms and objects and obstacles, monsters, just like the text adventure game, but using graphics, animation, sound, using a joystick, not a keyboard. So how did that go? Well, it didn't get started off very well because I started making the display screen for the game, which is the first thing you did when you made an Atari video game. And I had a relatively new boss who didn't really understand the Atari 26 hardware very well. It was very weird hardware. And so he made kind of a simple-minded decision. He heard that he knew what Colossal Cave was. It was quite well known in the middle 70s. And he knew that it used 100K of memory to implement it. And the 2600 only had 4K. So factor of 25, he concluded it was impossible. And he told me that and told me not to work on it. So if you see this little graphic on the screen there where a sword is being stabbed into the dragon by the avatar, that's what he tried to do to my game. Okay? He tried to kill it in the crib. But I thought I could do it. I already had a plan that was feasible. So what did I do? I did not do what a good employee would do and just do what I was told. I ignored him and I worked on it at night in secret. We'll get into the politics at Atari a little bit later in the talk, but right now I'm just going to talk about how I did it. So the challenge was to make a game that was interesting and fun that fit into the 4K. And fitting into the 4K, making a program that was interesting and fit into 4K bytes was not easy, okay? And so in general, what I had to do is come up with some objects and creatures that were interesting and that the whole set of stuff worked together into the tiny memory. And to jump ahead somewhat, my idea worked. The game contained 30 rooms, 30 different screens, 14 objects. You can see them there. 3 keys, a sword, the Holy Grail, which the Atari marketing department renamed the Enchanted Chalice, a magnet, which would attract other objects. This little square was the avatar, which I called the man. And then there were 3 castle doors. You might call them portcullises, the kind of door that a castle would have where it rises up when it's open and it slams down shut when it's shut. And then this last purple thing is a bridge that you could use to cross walls. And the creatures in the game were, I had 3 different instances of a dragon. So I had a red dragon, a yellow dragon, a green dragon. And then this thing here is a bat that would fly around and pick up stuff and move it to new locations. And it would even steal an object you were carrying from you sometimes. So this was pretty good to make a game that had 30 different screenfuls of stuff, because prior to that, all video games took place on a single screen. Okay, you didn't go off screen. That's all there was one screen full of stuff. Okay, maybe you played some of these old games. That's what they were like. So all of a sudden, the universe that you were playing the game in was much bigger. 30 rooms that you could move from one to the other, and that allowed me to have more. Once you had 30 rooms, there's room for 14 objects and 4 creatures. Okay. Here's the game world. This is the 30 rooms, and I'll just point out a few things. There are 3 castles. There's the black castle, the yellow castle, the white castle. There, I grouped the room had different regions, is how I thought of it. So here's the blue maze. It consisted of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rooms, okay? And they were interconnected. There were just 2, 3 ways in and out of the blue maze. So you started out here at the yellow castle, and then you could, if you went down here through this opening, you'd get into this room. And then if you went off the left side of the screen, you'd get into this room. And if you went through this door, I've got these white arrows to show where you ended up, you'd get into the blue maze. And then if you managed to find your way through the passage of the blue maze, which was a little bit complicated, but you could do it after you explored it, you would get up here and get to the black castle and open the gate to get in there. And then if you did that, you'd get into this room, and then you went a little further, you were in this maze here. So I hope that gives you the idea of how it worked. And to give you a little better idea of how it worked, I'm going to show you a video. So stop share. Share screen. Okay. Now, the sound effects don't start for 10 seconds or so, but the yellow square is you. It's the avatar. And I just went up, or it's me in this case. I just went up and picked up an object, the yellow key, and I dropped it, and now I'm going to pick up that arrow, which is actually the sword, which you can use to kill dragons. So there's a dragon. Well, I just killed it, okay? That was a very short battle compared to what happens sometimes. And there's the green dragon. All right. Killed it too. Now in this game, you could only carry 1 object at a time. So I dropped the sword, and I'm going to pick up the black key, okay? And now I'm just going to, since I made the game, I have a pretty good idea how to navigate through it. So but of course a player would have to explore this maze and figure out what was on the other side of it. And there are a lot of dead ends and so forth, but eventually he would find his way through it. Now that purple thing is an object, a bridge. And I just showed you that the bridge lets me cross through a maze wall, which can be quite useful sometimes. Now the horseshoe-shaped thing is a magnet. Okay? You can see that it attracts the black key. There's the Holy Grail, the Enchanted Chalice. Notice that it has magical shifting colors. So now we're retracing our steps through the blue maze. If you can bring the enchanted chalice, there's a carcass of a dragon I killed. If you can bring the enchanted chalice back home to the yellow castle, you win. Okay, now let's shift back to slides. Okay, share. Now hopefully we see the slides again on the screen. Come on now. Okay. So that video run through, I hope, gives you a little bit better idea of what it was like to play this game adventure with the multiple screens, the large game world. And you saw me picking up objects for purposes. So now we're going to get more into the implementation of how the game program worked. Okay. So again, the short answer to how did I do it was good data structures and efficient coding. But I'm going to focus mainly on data structures, and I'm going to show you three. The room list, the object list, and the chase flee list, each of which was a data structure that I designed. And so the room list was a data structure that defined the layout, all the rooms, the mazes that comprised the game world, okay? So it was structured as an array of structs, if you could say that in the C programming language terminology. So this diagram, this part of the diagram is meant to show that there was an array of identical structures, structs, and in fact, they were numbered from 0 to 29 because there were 30 rooms in the game. And then each struct had a few components. There's a pointer to the graphics for the room, pointer to graphics data, which was actually 21 bytes long. Then there was a 1 byte color code, a 1 byte that contained a few 1-bit attributes for the rooms, but I'm not going to get into that in this talk. And then maybe the most important thing here was there were 4 pointers to the adjacent rooms. So for example, if you were in the castle, yellow castle room here, and you went down, you'd get into the room that was to the south. And then if you went to the east, you'd get into this room, and it has a door down at the bottom. So if you went south, you'd get into this room. And of course, if you were in this room, you could go north, or you could go south, or you could go west, or you could go east, provided there was a door in the wall. So these, the north, south, east, and west 1 byte data elements were there. I thought of them as pointers to the adjacent room, but they were actually, if you wanted to be picky, you'd say that they were indices into this array, okay? And one thing I want to say now, and I'm going to say it again several times probably, is every design decision I made in making this game was informed by how little memory I had. I had 4,096 bytes of ROM, and I had 128 bytes of RAM. So I had 32 times as much ROM as I had RAM. So I really had to be careful with the RAM memory. I had to conserve it religiously, okay? All right, now let's look at the second data structure, the object list. So this data structure is a little bit more complicated. There were 20 objects in the game, if you counted every single thing. And again, it was structured as an array of structs, and each struct required 9 bytes to represent it. So the whole thing, or the 20 objects, so it's not that hard to multiply 9 by 20. So this data structure required 180 bytes. So it used up about 5% of the ROM, not counting this other stuff that had pointers going to it. So the elements that were in the object list, where there was a pointer to the location of the object. And this would be put into RAM, because if you had an object like one of those dragons that moved around, the room you were in was changing and your X coordinates and Y coordinates were changing. And that's why this part would be in ROM, but this data element would be in RAM. And that's why I used a pointer there, because they couldn't be adjacent, because RAM and ROM were in different parts of the memory space. And then this pointer here is a pointer to the state of the object. And this was usually in RAM, at least for those objects which had states that changed. The dragon, for example, had 4 different behavioral states. And so its state data was in RAM. And then this pointer pointed off to a table of graphics data. This may not be that easy to understand on first time you hear about it, but the table made an association between state numbers and then had a pointer off to some graphics data. So what I did was I built in an automatic correspondence between whatever the state of the dragon, for example, was, and its visual appearance on a screen, which was represented by graphics data here, here, and here. Hope that makes sense. And then I had a byte to describe the color of the object, for example, for dragons, red, yellow, or green. And then again, like in the room list, I had a few 1-bit attributes that affected things like how big it was. Now, a question a reasonable person might ask is, why are there so many pointers in this data structure? And the reason is, every one of those pointers is there because I was conserving RAM memory. This pointer was there because this could sometimes be ROM, but if it was an object that didn't move, like the castle gate, then I'd put this in ROM, and that would save me 3 bytes each time I did that. And there are 3 castles, so that saved me 9 bytes of RAM right there. And if that sounds like a tiny amount of memory, it wasn't for me in that context. It was almost 10% of the RAM I had available. And the reason that these other, for a similar reason. Okay. All right, so that was a quick glimpse at the data structures that defined the game world itself, and then the objects that occupied the game world. Okay. Now I'm going to show you a third data structure, which I call the chase flee list. And I'm going to tell you why I needed this data structure. I had a game design problem when I was about 2/3 of the way done with this game. And the problem was I had done the thing that my boss said I could not do. I had implemented the Colossal Cave style of adventure game graphically on the Atari 2600, but it was boring. It was stupid. There was a thing that I called the dragon, and it chased you around, but that's all it did. It chased you for all eternity. It was kind of a unidimensional creature. And it was good. It was sort of good as far as it went. That when it was chasing you, that was interesting when you went through mazes and multiple rooms, and you could double back sometimes and lose it. So the chase actually was pretty good, but it just wasn't enough somehow. That was my feeling. And I didn't know what to do. I was stuck. And I didn't want to, nobody wanted it actually. So I was not under pressure to release it. So I actually stopped for a few months and worked on something else. And I was just trying to figure out how to make the game more interesting. Okay. And then after a few months, I did come up with an idea that turned out to be very good. And the idea was, I remembered that I'd studied something called behaviorism in science class in high school. Behaviorism was a theory about animal behavior. And the idea was you could describe the behavior of animals with stimulus-response rules. Okay. So like, for example, predator-prey relationship, that could be described by the stimulus would be, let's say it's a fox chasing a rabbit. The stimulus would be this fox saw the rabbit, and its response would be to chase it. And then on the rabbit side, the rabbit would see the fox coming at it and would run away. I called that fleeing. And behaviorism actually worked pretty well to describe certain types of animal behavior. It described predator-prey relationship very well. And I decided to use that idea, stimulus-response rules, in my game, okay? And so what you see on this screen is I'm using the yellow dragon as an example. And the behavior of the yellow dragon, I wrote a program to make it have a behavior that worked as follows. It had 4 stimulus response rules. Here they are. If it saw the sword, it would run away. The man, the avatar, it would chase it. You saw that happening in the run-through of adventure. If it saw the chalice, it would go towards it, okay? So this was the total behavioral repertoire of the yellow dragon. And over here, I have shown another way to visualize it. This is the yellow dragon's in the center, and these things surrounding it are its mental world. The things it was scared of were the sword and the yellow key, and it would run away from them. And the things that it wanted was, it wanted to eat you. And if the man wasn't around, it would go towards the towards the chalice and just sit on it, okay? And I thought of these behaviors as simulating desires and fears, okay? So the yellow dragon feared the sword and it feared the key, but it desired the chalice and it desired you because it wanted to eat you. So this actually was a pretty good scheme, and it was relatively simple, actually. But there was one issue that immediately came up once I implemented this scheme is, what happens if 2 objects are in the room at the same time? Then you have a conflict between your stimulus response rules. So, for example, what if the sword and the avatar are in the same room with the dragon? What's it going to do? Okay. Well, what I decided was I chose really the simplest solution, but it's pretty good. I just prioritized the list of objects. So this was implemented as a list in memory. And you just go down the list and respond to the first object you came to in your iteration through the chase flee list. And you would respond to the highest priority object in the room, okay? So in this case, if the sword and the man were both in the same room with the yellow dragon, the sword had higher priority, and so it would ignore the man and it would run away from the sword and it would go off screen pretty quickly. Okay. So what would happen if the yellow dragon was chasing the man and then the bat flew into the room carrying the sword? What would happen is the dragon would appear to change its mind because a higher priority object showed up, and it in some sense, it did change its mind, if you're willing to call this little program a mind. So this was actually a really cool scheme. It solved my problem beautifully of making the game more interesting. Different dragons, the yellow dragon, red dragon, green dragon, and I gave them each a slightly different chase flee list. They mostly did the same thing. They all 3 chased the avatar, but they had different objects that they would guard. And they also had different speeds. Yellow and the green one were not as fast. The red one had a speed of 3, and these 2 had a speed of 2. So that was another difference that made the game interesting. The players said that the red dragon was meaner than the other 2. And I also used the chase flee list to implement the bat, although it only chased things. But the chase flee list gave me a way to decide which object to go after if there was more than one object in the room that the bat flew into. And I also sort of shoehorned the chase flee list construction to implement another object, the magnet, But what I did was I flipped the role of the thing being chased and the chaser and the chasee. I made the magnet didn't chase things. It made other objects chase it. So from the player's point of view, it was a magnet and it attracted keys that had gotten stuck in the wall, okay? It was a solution to a bug in the game, is actually why I implemented it. But the chase flee list turned out to be very useful and versatile. So it also, back to the theme of conserving memory, this was an extremely efficient representation of behaviors in terms of how much memory it used. Each of these stimulus response rules used up 2 bytes. So there were 4 stimulus response rules. It was a 0 terminated structure. So there was a 0 byte at the end to show that the list of rules had terminated. So 9 bytes described those 4 stimulus response rules. That was a lot of behavioral complexity for a very small cost in terms of memory. And this was the key idea that made the game a success, I think. And one thing that I think is kind of funny is nobody told me I was doing AI research back then. I was just trying to make a game that was more interesting than the one I had when I was 2/3 done. But I think you could say it was a kind of primitive AI research. So so that's all on the chase flee list, but it was a very good idea, and it's what made the game a success. So what I'm showing you now is just, this is sort of an overview of how I was able to fit this fairly complicated game, a system that only had 128 bytes of RAM. This is the complete data that represented the game, the state of the game adventure, and it was 49 bytes long. It was a contiguous block of RAM memory. And so how many objects are there here? Dot, 3 dragons, magnet, sword, chalice, bridge, 3 keys, the state of the 3 doors to the castle, and the bat. And you can see that the garden variety objects like the magnet, sword, chalice, and so forth used up 3 bytes. And the bytes were what room was it in, what was its X coordinate, what was its Y coordinate. The dragons were a little bit more complicated because I added to those 3 elements that were in RAM, what direction was it currently going in and what was its behavioral state. And then you could think of the bat as, from a programmer's point of view, as sort of it had the same 5 data elements as the dragon, room, X, Y, direction, state, but I added 2 more elements, a timer, and also the object the bat was carrying. So you could say that the bat was a modified dragon if you wanted to. So I only had 128 bytes total, and I needed some of that for variables in the program, and I had needed a little bit of it, about 10 bytes for the stack, that the subroutine stack. So this game showed that you could actually do a lot with 49 bytes of RAM. And then one last thing about the game was, you didn't see this in the run through, but there was a creature called the bat that would fly around and pick up objects and move them, and then later drop it and pick up another object. And it would even steal objects that you were carrying from you. And the reason that the bat was added was to make the game, keep it from being too predictable. Because when I was almost done with the game, it was just an informal thing where the people there kind of liked playing the games that the programmers were developing. It was kind of interesting to watch them come to life. So they liked adventure, but once they had figured out how to find their way through the mazes and get the chalice and bring it back to the Yell Castle, once you'd done it, you knew how to do it, and it wasn't that hard to do it again. And the game kind of lost its play value. There wasn't a good reason to replay it. at that time. And I was pondering on how to make it more interesting. And adding the bat to it really did make it a lot more interesting to replay, because the bat was moving stuff around and it wasn't predictable anymore. So, a summary of what I had to do to implement this game is, Adventure would have never happened without my computer science training that I got as an undergraduate at Rice in Houston, Texas, and at University of California at Berkeley, where I got a master's degree in computer science. I learned so much from all those courses, and I needed significant parts of that knowledge when I got to Atari and was faced with actual programming problems. It involved, I had to design some new data structures. I used pointers because I knew what they were, and I'd been forced to use them in certain classes. And efficient coding is kind of a general term, but what it meant was that every byte had to make a contribution. And if there was a long, complicated way to do something and a short, efficient way to do it, I damn well better use the short, efficient way to do it. And that drew on many pieces of my computer science training. So at Atari, all the ideas that were invented there in the early days of video game design were built in a brutally limited computing environment. And great ideas would have been worthless without the technical skill to overcome the hard programming challenges. There would have been no Adventure without that training that I got at Rice and Berkeley. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and tell you a political story or two. So I wonder if you can read this. What it says is created by Warren Robinett. Okay, this was the secret room that I created in Adventure. It's, and the backstory is that why did I put this weird looking signature into my game? Well, the reason was that Atari had been bought by Warner Communications shortly before I got a job there. And they were big money guys in New York, and they played hardball, and they were not designers any public recognition at all. And I was kind of proud of Adventure. It was a good idea, and I had to fight with my boss and the Atari marketing department to get it to happen at all. And then they're going to give me no public credit whatsoever. I knew for certain that my name was not going to be on the box that the cartridge came in. But at a certain point, I realized that I had total control over what was on the screen. So I created a secret room that was really hard to get to, and I put my name in that secret room. You're looking at it, my signature right now. And I didn't tell anyone, and I mean no one, because I was tempted to tell my friends at Atari, Tom Ruderdahl and Jim Heather. But then I thought to myself, okay, Warren, if you can't keep the secret yourself, how can you expect Jim and Tom to keep a secret? And then I said back to myself, yeah, you're right. So I didn't tell anyone, and Atari manufactured 100,000 or 200,000 copies of the Adventure cartridge in 1979 and 1980 and shipped them all over the world. And about 6 months after it was released, maybe 8 months, in August of 1980, a 15-year-old kid from Salt Lake City writes a letter to Atari and makes a map and tells exactly how to get into the secret room. Okay, fine. So did they punish me? Well, no, I had quit by then. Did they take away my royalty? No, they didn't give me any royalty. So there wasn't really much I could do, and I won this battle. I got public credit for my game. It was sneaky, but I feel that I was kind of oppressed by the complete refusal to admit that the game designers had any creativity or any claim to public recognition. I fought back. uh, and I'm not apologizing. So I guess that's the end of that political story. And I didn't call it an Easter egg, by the way. A subsequent manager of the game designer, Steve Wright at Atari, he didn't really have a dog in the fight between me and my earlier supervisor. And so when he was the manager in 1980 of the Atari 2600 game designers, and when he was told by somebody that there was this secret in the game, and he probably played through it and looked at it, he sort of mulled over this, and then what he said was, it's kind of cool to have hidden surprises in video games. It's kind of like waking up on Easter morning and searching for the little colored eggs underneath the flowers and bushes. So Steve Wright coined the term Easter egg. What I called to myself was my signature. All right. So if you want more information on adventure, I've written 2 books, although they're not published yet, but I hope to get them out fairly soon. One of them is called Making the Dragon, and it's the political story, which has the story I just told you and a bit of other stuff about how the game was made. And then the second book, The Annotated Adventure, is the technical story about the gory details of exactly how I wrote the program that implemented the game. And you can read more about this at my website, warrenrobinette.com/adventure. And some other sources of information on adventures. There's a pretty good documentary, World 1-1, made by a couple of young filmmakers a few years ago. It's pretty good. It has some interviews with me and about 10 other Atari game designers. It's good. And then there's an academic book called Racing the Beam, published by MIT Press, that is also pretty good. It looks at it from a different perspective, but they're both good in their own way. So to summarize my talk about the design and development of Atari 2600 Adventure, it's the first action-adventure video game, sold 1.3 million units at $25 each. So that's more than $30 million if you want to do the math quickly. And what did I get paid? I got paid a salary of $20,000 a year. Okay, quite a contrast between those two, but I'm not going to whine too much because it was a stepping stone for me. And a year later, I was starting a company with 3 partners, the Learning Company, which was pretty successful. So taking the job at Atari was a good move for me, and it led to good things. Adventure established the genre. I think we can say it was widely imitated. The Legend of Zelda was one of its descendants. And that's it. Thank you very much. We're going to take some questions now, I think. So I'm going to get out of this slide. Gio, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. And well, thank you, Warren. This was, you know, a great tour of everything that happened. I hope the CS computer science students, they learn a few things, a few tricks, and how you can do a lot with just a little. So that's great. So we got a bunch of questions, and many of them are from computer science students. So let me just get started. One of them, I think you addressed in one of your slides, the importance of having a college degree and becoming a developer. If you could say a little bit about that trajectory, why did you move to California, and things like that.
Okay. Well, what's most important, being very well trained in computer science really did enable me to do what I did at Atari. I totally believe it, although I didn't realize it till decades later. At the time, I just thought I was a smart guy and that I won, okay? Maybe that's the typical attitude of a 20-something. But later on, I realized that the support of my family and all the stuff I learned from my teachers from elementary school and high school, and especially at Rice University and Berkeley, computer science department. It was the foundation that enabled me to do something maybe others wouldn't have been able to figure out. The programming skill really did allow me to take it to a different level. It really did. And that's, I'm not bragging about myself, I'm thanking my teachers. Okay. And then as far as why did I move to California, I'll give you a sort of a parallel case. I'm going to tell you the name of somebody who also grew up in my hometown in Missouri, in the middle of the United States, in Springfield, Missouri. And when I tell you his name, you're going to agree with me that he made the right decision to leave Missouri and go to California. His name is Brad Pitt. Mm-hmm. He would not have become a movie star if he didn't go to California, because that's where. So why did I go to California? Well, I had applied to graduate school and got into 4 different grad schools. One was here where I live now, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Another was in Colorado. 2 were in California. One of them was Berkeley, and I chose Berkeley. And why? Really, I chose it because of the California mystique, because that's where things happened. It wasn't any more complicated than that. And I didn't even know about Silicon Valley maybe when I just made that decision. But like the fact that Hollywood was in California and that's where Brad Pitt went to make it, Silicon Valley was just 50 miles down the road from Berkeley, California, on the other end of the bay. And that's where the whole computer industry got started. So, and Gio went to California too. Why did you go to California, Gio?
Well, I mean, that's where you learn stuff, right? Those people go to California for learning. And it's a perfect place to learn. You got all the environment, beach, snow, and people from all over the world, right? I mean, you can just say people say from China, India, Brazil, anyone can succeed based upon the person's own merit, right? So that's one of the reasons why people go to California, I think.
Yeah, that part is absolutely true. It doesn't matter what your national origin or race is in Silicon Valley. Everything I've ever experienced there.
Yeah.
Did I answer the question?
I think so. That is pretty good for all the young fellas that are listening to us and trying to make up their minds. So there are a few other technical questions, and one of them is a little bit more specific, but I like to touch upon that, which is it necessary to have a graphics engine to create games in both 2D or 3D, or to know how to program, even though some graphics have visual programming? I guess the question is a little bit more in terms of what kind of tools that you have to know to create games. I mean, do you need to go deep into basic, like a low level programming, or can you do higher level? I guess that's the question.
Well, what I would say is that when you're learning, you should use all the tools that are available to you. And it's probably 100 times easier to make a prototype game to sort of learn how to do it using the high level tools like graphics engines and so forth. And you can get started, even back in the late 70s, you could buy an Apple II computer and write a simple video game in BASIC. You could do it in a week or something. A simple one. You could like re-implement Pong or something, which would teach you a lot, actually. So my answer is yes. Tools you've got available, and some of which make it simple to get started making games. That lets you do the design at a high level. But if you want to make a competitive game, like if you and your 2 buddies want to make an indie game, well, it's very competitive out there. And there are some examples you can trot out about one or two people that made a game that made them millionaires, like Angry Birds is an example. So sometimes a good idea is all you need, but I think Angry Birds came out at the right time, and it probably wouldn't make millions of dollars now. Hard to know, but probably to make a breakthrough game that you know, let me put it this way, the people that play video games, they're very cruel and heartless audience. They don't care how hard it is to make. They want an interesting game that they've never seen before. They don't care how hard it is to make it. It's your problem to get the skills to make them something that interests them. And there's a friend of mine told me a few years ago that there are 100,000 new apps that come out for the iPhone every month. Okay, so it's competitive, and you need not only programming skills, but there better be somebody on the team that has art skills. Like people have told me from time to time, a little bit too often, that my dragons look like ducks, okay? And the truth is they do look like ducks. What I say to them sometimes is, if you think you can do a better dragon in an 8 pixel wide, 16 pixel high bitmap, let's see it, okay? But the truth is there's some pretty good artists in the world, and they could make a better dragon than what I made, but it's a competitive world, and if you're competing on the worldwide stage and you want to get rich making an indie video game, you better have some good art talent on your team, and you better have some good programming talent too.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I would add to the list a game that my kids used to play, Minecraft, right? With really blind characters and really little, I mean, not a whole lot of computational resources for people, and they loved it. I don't understand.
Well, that guy was in Sweden, right? And that was a really different idea. It was a stroke of creative genius. Minecraft was it, but I'm sure he had some technical problems too.
Oh, that's great. There is now that you talk about like putting out a game, I think there are some entrepreneurship questions that I think are interesting here that we should address, and one of them, Carlos Bermudez Mendonça, is, according to your experience, what is the key factor for creating a gaming startup today?
Mm-hmm. Let's see, that one, you sent me that one previously.
Yeah,
I did think about that.
By the way, we had questions that were asked prior to this event, and this was the first question that was asked. So we're pretty excited that people, as soon as they saw the ad, all the advertisement, they started making questions. So.
Yeah, well, so here's my answer. It repeats a little bit of what I said earlier, but what does it take to get into the game market these days? So this is both an entrepreneurial question and a creative question of, I want to be a game designer. How do I do it? It's sort of similar to the question of, I want to be a novelist. How do I get started? My answer for getting started as a game designer is, it's competitive, and you need a good education, both in computer science and art on your team. You need a good idea, plus you need guts, stubbornness, ability to convince people, judgment, and it's a hard road. But your odds are better than the kid from Arkansas, Bill Clinton, who became president of the United States, and your odds are better from the kid from Plains, Georgia, Jimmy Carter, who became president of the United States. So if you don't try, it's not going to happen.
That's great. Now I have another question here, which is because you've been mentioning the role of interaction with artists and things like that. And one interesting book that came out a few years ago by John Markov, which the name of the book is What the Dormouse Said. And it was about how the 60 counterculture helped, set up Silicon Valley to what it is. And as you're describing, what was the environment at Atari in the late 70s? Because this is home, right? Like when John Markov said about something like that, the counterculture.
Yeah.
How did that?
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that because the people at Atari were hippies, and the hippie era got started in the 60s, but just in a few places like San Francisco and New York City. But during the 70s is when it really spread out all over the place. So I'm still wearing flannel shirts and tennis shoes. Okay. But I had a beard back then. Let's see. To be more specific, Atari was loose. People worked there because it was a cool job. You were given at least Atari changed a lot from one decade to another, even 1 year to another. But during the time I was there, from 1977 to 79, it was a cool job because they gave you the complete freedom to invent a video game idea, but then you had the responsibility to implement it so that it actually fit into the tiny memories and was fun. And it made sense at the time to do that because the memories were small enough that one person actually could fill up the ROM. So you couldn't do anything more really once you filled up the ROM unless you could compress the program somehow. People did try to do that sometimes, but the guy who was my first boss at Atari, Larry Kaplan, described this process. We called it crunchy, okay? So like you had 4,096 bytes of ROM, but your program was 100 bytes too long. So could you somehow eliminate things and squeeze it and write the program in a more compact fashion? Well, Kaplan said it was like squeezing water out of a rock. That was a great description. So losing track of what question I'm answering. Did I answer it?
Yeah, I guess the question was more like you had an environment that was
what was it like? Yeah. So the programmers liked working at Atari because you were given creative freedom. And designing a video game, nobody knew what video games were going to be like. So we were inventing the world of video games then. It was fascinating, actually. It wasn't everybody's cup of tea to be given that much creative freedom, actually, but quite a few of the people there rose to the challenge. So it was exciting to go to work. And I personally did not think of it as a competition with the some of the game designers there were competitive types and wanted to win. They wanted to be the top. They wanted to be the guy. So there were different motivations from different people, but you came to work whenever you wanted. There's no set hours. I got to work at 11 a.m. usually and went home at 7 or 8 or 9 p.m. I was into it, so I worked pretty hard. It was kind of solitary because each person was working just on their own game, but we did share some little snippets of code sometimes. But and if you walked into the lab where the development systems were, you never knew what you would see on the screen because you didn't have to make a pitch to anybody to try an idea. You just go start implementing it. That's maybe what I should have said when I tell my story about the secret room is the culture was, you have an idea? Go spend a week and make the beginnings of a prototype. You didn't ask permission, you just went and started coding. But things were changing when this new boss, his name was George, when George came in, he had worked at Lockheed, an aircraft manufacturer, and he thought engineers should do what they were told. But Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, he didn't tell you what to do. He said, go make something cool.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we covered most of the technical questions and work environment. I apologize for all the questions that are not exactly answered, but I think most of your questions, your answers answered most of the questions and also during the talk. So please, everyone that had asked questions, if you don't hear your question here, is because I made that judgment here. So blame me. But there into other things is a lot of people are interested in virtual reality and augmented reality. And how do you see that changing the way people do gaming these days? I mean, it's more like a futuristic question.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought about that one a little bit.
I think the question is, how do you see the future of virtual reality in entertainment or technical areas? So I think this,
yeah.
Chris.
So I'm not sure if you said this in my introduction in Portuguese, but I was a researcher in virtual reality for about 15 years after I worked at Atari in the Learning Company. And so I do have some thoughts about that. But I make a distinction between what the possibilities are for augmented reality versus virtual reality. What interests me the most about augmented reality is attaching sensors to the AR system such that you can see things that are normally invisible. And I wrote a paper about this. It's called Electronic Expansion of Human Perception. And you could access it on my website, warrenrobinette.com, under the papers subsection, papers page. And I'll give you an example of something that's being worked on by a little company in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I live right now. It's they have an augmented reality system that is hooked up to an ultrasound system, such as is used to look at the fetus in the stomach of a mother. And but if you set it up right and attach the ultrasound, or if you attach the ultrasound sensor to the helmet and do a little bit of computation to imaging from the ultrasound sensor with the position of the person wearing the AR system, then you in effect have X-ray vision. It's not really using X-rays, but it's like in the comic books, Superman's X-ray vision. You've synthesized technologically the ability to see inside of that bump on the mother's stomach, to see the fetus inside of there. That's an amazing ability to see inside of a solid thing. And I think it's especially dramatic when, there's a procedure called amniocentesis where some fluid from the amniotic sac is withdrawn to do genetic tests, make sure the baby's okay, right? But it's very, very important that the needle goes where doesn't touch the fetus, right? And if you can actually, in effect, see the needle going in and see where it is three-dimensionally, you have a better chance of performing that procedure correctly, right? So that's one example. Another example is this talk is getting has real-time captions that are being attached to it right now as I speak, I believe, because we did that last night when we were practicing. And so that's computer transduction or computer conversion of speech to text, right? Which is pretty useful sometimes. And we also have, if you go into Google Translate, the ability to translate, for example, between Portuguese and English. And so there's really no reason that you couldn't have an AR system with microphones that has the ability to do speech to text, and then the reverse, text to speech synthesis, and weave language to language translation into it, so that you and I, Gio, could have assuming you didn't speak English, I speak only English, you speak only Portuguese, there's no reason we couldn't have an AR helmet where I'm talking to you and you see what I say translated into Portuguese, and then you respond in Portuguese, and my end of the system translates it into English in real time. This is not easy to do, but yet it's not beyond the realm of possibility either. And I claim that if you built it into a system so it's like you're seeing the speech of the other person, it takes it to a whole new level. These are the kind of things I would like to see done with augmented reality.
Yeah, that's pretty useful. But there was also something that Russ Taylor, right, built in the late 90s that I actually ended up using, which was called the nano manipulator. So for those of you, we managed to touch a nanometer size surface with a stylus. This was 1998. This is like 24 years ago.
Yeah, the nano manipulator was an example of this same thing, electronic expansion of human perception. In this case, the sensor and the actuator were the same system. It was a scanning tunneling microscope, and because you could use it as an input device where it scans the sample underneath the surface and measures its three-dimensional contour, but then you could switch into a different mode and use the little tiny microscopic probe to push around nanoscopic sized things like you could push a strand of DNA around on the surface. You could really do it. So it lets you both see and touch these microscopic things. So that's another example
that's a pretty cool one.
Yeah. Now, should I talk about VR?
Yeah.
That's the other part of the question.
Yeah.
VR is kind of, in my opinion, it hasn't really taken off yet. A lot of people are tantalized by the idea of it. Like Star Trek had this Star Trek Next holodeck, but it used Hollywood movie techniques to make it seem like it would be exactly like reality. But that's kind of a rather gross overselling of the whole concept, because tactile, for example, is pretty hard to do. And a few people have tried smell output devices, but really it's not yet anywhere close to being exactly like reality. And so, in my opinion, there's some potential there, but virtual reality is kind of like a solution looking for problem, in my opinion. The killer app for VR has not been made yet. No, if anybody knew what the killer app was, they would have made it, right? But back in the 70s, nobody knew what video games were going to be like. You would have been laughed out of the room if you said video games were going to make more money than movies and music combined. But it's true. Video games now do make more money than movies and recorded music combined. So we really don't know. And that's an opportunity for the young people listening to this, is you need to go educate yourself about what the unique capabilities of VR are. And I think that the breakthrough application will probably rely on, it'll be something that VR can do, but regular old apps on the screen cannot do. I'm not quite sure what that is, but I'd say it's waiting for a seed of creativity that I think there may be a killer app that is obvious in retrospect, but maybe it's already there and I'm just not aware of it. I haven't been tracking VR that much in the last 2 or 3 years. Is there a killer app out there, Gio, for VR?
I'm not sure. Not really, but there is something. And then, But before prefacing my question, I mean, there's something that was the movie that came, but out, right? That with COVID, right? Ready Player One, it drawn some sort of dystopian scenario that we just for a smidge, we would have been there, right? With COVID, people have classes in that sort of environment. But before we get into that question, because I want to hear a little bit about the story behind that. When you put together, and that's more an IP-oriented question, often not get credit. So I got lots of questions here, people saying, all right, so what was, I mean, I understand the motivation. I mean, you said you put something together, you had a contract, but nobody wanted to acknowledge. So from those, so what has changed, right? Like from the days that people did not get credit to nowadays. And they say, for example, if you upload, like if you have like Adobe Photoshop, the list of authors of the code is huge, and they make sure they put it on there. So how did you see that transition happening?
Well, I wasn't philosophical about it at the time. I was pissed off. They actually, the day that I interviewed at Atari, I was promised a 10 cents per cartridge royalty on the games that I made, but and so if you work the numbers, Adventure sold 1.3 million units, so that would have been $130,000. Well, I was getting paid $20,000 a year salary, so that would have been 6 or 7 times my annual salary. But what happened was they didn't put it in the agreement that I signed on my first day of work, and I noticed that. But I guess you could say they put me on the hot seat. Am I going to complain about it not being on in the contract on my first day of work and get in a fight the first day of work and walk out? Well, I probably would have never made Adventure if I'd done that, possibly. So I didn't make a big scene the first day, and then they just never mentioned it again. And the hardware designers at Atari did have the royalty in their contract. And guess what? The guys from New York totally stiffed them. There's something called Hollywood accounting, where you make sure that the project that you're paying royalties on doesn't make any profit on paper, because you just come up with some expenses and fees and whatnot in the corporate structure. So Jay Miner was brilliant. He was the chip designer who managed the design of the custom chip in the Atari 2600. He was not a young guy. He was in his 50s then. And the day he found out they were cheating him, he walked. Okay.
So basically, in order to calculate the royalties, they would just inflate the expenses, right? They would just say, oh well, it's...
Yeah, but on a slightly higher level, this was a subsidiary of Warner Communications. It had billions of dollars in play. Atari was making multiple billions of dollars per year in 81 and 82. And so an individual is going to get into a legal battle with a corporation with $1 billion of assets. You knew you were going to lose. It was stupid to even, you were just totally outgunned. So they stiffed us. Okay, promised us a royalty, didn't give it. So did that answer a question, or was I just getting mad all over again?
No, that's good, because it's important for most people when they sign contracts or they develop something to make sure that they read the contract. So part of our role as a technology transfer office is to help people get people to read contracts and see what they're into, right?
Let me go over onto the more positive side. I learned a lot working at Atari, and I designed 3 commercial video games in 18 months while I was there. It was an education you could not possibly buy anywhere in the world. And I went on to design educational games and start a company. So Atari gave me an education I could not have gotten anywhere else, I don't think. And the company I started, the learning company, was quite successful. So it was a stepping stone for me. And so I'm not sorry I went to Atari. It was irritating to be promised a financial share and then just having it taken away. Anybody with a little bit of a spine would get mad in that situation. But what I did was I walked away. But after I got that education that I could never have gotten anywhere else, and I stuck my secret room in there, my signature was a little parting gift to my Atari overlords, right? So life is complicated sometimes, and you gotta decide how you're going to respond to these things.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. There's always something to be learned. But then, if we may, as we're drawing towards the end of our time here, for which we're greatly appreciate. So, what is the story? I mean, so you made that secret room, and then how did it happen that someone figured that out and decided to write a book?
Oh, you mean Ready Player One?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Well, so I've gotten to know Ernie Cline a little bit because there was a 7-year gap between when he published his novel Ready Player One and when the movie came out. Okay, and so he was doing a book tour about 4 years ago, where he came through Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I live, and he sent me an email and said he wanted to meet. So I had lunch with him the day that he was in Chapel Hill, and we got to know each other a bit. And I thought it was kind of cool that he actually mentioned me in his book. It was fiction, except I'm not fiction, I don't think. Look pretty real. So, and then he lives in Austin, Texas. So about a year later, when I was in Austin, I called him up and we had lunch again and drove around. And he owns 2 DeLoreans with the doors that open up. And one of them's tricked out to look exactly like the DeLorean in Back to the Future. Okay, so Ernie wrote this science fiction novel. It was a big success. And then when you go from novelist whose novel is turned into a movie, all of a sudden you've got money coming out your ears. You got more money. Okay, so Ernie gets to indulge his fantasies a little bit with the toy cars and stuff, but so I'm not telling the story very well here. So, going back to the beginning, Ernie was 8 years old. He was playing. He had an Atari. He had adventure. He was playing adventure, and he recognized the clues that I had left in there, and he found the secret room with my signature, created by Warren Robinette. And he told me it blew his mind, and it stayed with him. And then 30 years later, he's written a couple of science fiction novels, and he'd actually written a screenplay for one earlier movie too. I'm forgetting the name of it, but he was established as a novelist, and he remembered this secret room thing, and he used it as a plot element in his novel. Okay. And since Ernie and I had already been in contact for 2 or 3 years at the time that the movie came out, kind of sporadic, but we sent some emails back and forth. And I think I visited him twice in Austin, maybe. And so he offered to get me 2 tickets to the premiere in Hollywood, Ready Player One. And so she's a New Zealander. She hadn't been to any Hollywood premieres. She was very interested to go to a Hollywood premiere, and so was I. I never had a chance to go to a Hollywood premiere, so it was pretty interesting just to be there. Steven Spielberg gets up on the stage before it screens for the first time and thanks people and talks about the process, and that was interesting to see how he handled it. It was kind of an insider moment. And then we watched the movie. Ernie told me he fought to keep my name in the script, but I didn't really know what that meant. And I was aware there's an editing process where stuff gets cut out. So I didn't I didn't expect that they'd say my full name 3 times in the movie. That surprised me a lot. But now you know why it happened. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because Ernie fought to keep my name in the script. I think it was a thank you to me for the blowing his mind 30 years earlier, right? And so then the movie ends and we go over to the after party, and Susan and I are walking around. We don't know anybody. It's 500 people there. But then finally I find Ernie, and all of a sudden I went from being Ernie starts introducing me to the director, to the producer, to some of the cast from the movie was there. So all of a sudden I went from being an outsider to being an insider. And it was interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I guess the cool thing is that Ernie did not do like Atari, right? I mean, he did recognize.
Yeah, that's right. Ernie did not stiff me like Atari did. You're right.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, I mean, that's a great way to end this morning for us here, Warren. I mean, I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time working.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah.
I wish I'd come to Brazil in person.
Yeah. Oh, who knows? Once this pandemic goes away, right?
Yeah. Let's do another talk.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to switch to Portuguese to wrap it up. But again, thank you so much, Warren. Really appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
All right. Então, pessoal, obrigado pela participação e com isso a gente termina a nossa transmissão. Obrigado.